Now we've dug into two papers that are looking at specific evidence of what happened in two particular local minimum wage increases, right? How those two particular minimum wage increases affected employment. But we might want to take a step back and say, given this evidence, what should we conclude about the minimum wage overall as a policy? In particular, what should we conclude about the longer term, bigger picture effects of national minimum wage changes? Right? If we want to think about something like, should we raise the federal minimum wage? How is that going to affect workers over the next 10 years? How do we extrapolate from the evidence that we have? So the challenge here, and this is going to be true in so many contexts when we look at research, is that we can get better evidence, better empirical evidence from local changes and better empirical evidence about what happens from local changes in the short run than we can from national changes in the long run, right? And the reason is, usually only get evidence when we have some sort of a control group. And it's just very, very difficult to have a control group for the entire United States of America. And it's difficult to believe that that control group would have had the same trends as the United States of America over 10 or 20 years, as opposed to over 1 or 2 years. So we find ourselves in the position, as we do so much of the time, trying to learn about long run and national changes from short run and local changes, right? And on top of this, as we said in Tuesday's material, the minimum wage is an important policy by itself, but part of the reason that we care about understanding this minimum wage evidence is because it can tell us more broadly what we should expect from policies that aim to increase workers' wages. Right? Things like so the long run effects to compare to short run effects of a minimum wage increase. So if we're in a neoclassical model, this is actually pretty straightforward, right? What we can say is we know from our unit on labor demand that long run labor demand is going to be more elastic than short run labor. The reason for this is, right, in the long run, you can adjust more factors of production. So in the long run, you can replace workers with capital more easily than you can in the short run. Right, and that can allow you to both have a substitution effect, right? You've swapped out a worker for capital. Also, more of a scale effect, right? You reduce the overall scope of your production. You produce less capital and produce less stuff in response to higher wages. So all of that's going to lead us in a neoclassical model to think that we're going to have a bigger reduction in employment in the long run than we do in the short run. On top of all that, if we think about kind of the very long run or the medium long run, we might think that in addition to just replacing workers with capital, we might change what sort of labor-saving technologies get invented by increasing the minimum. Right? We might be more likely to see businesses like McDonald's or Burger King or Walmart figure out how to replace cashiers with kiosks or to move some of their production off-site in areas that can be more capital-intensive instead of on-site within the store. Right? All of those things are going to change the amount of labor needed to produce a certain kind of output. And they're going to happen more in the long run than they do in the short. Now, if we think about what the implications of this are for the kind of employment changes we should expect, as we said, in a competitive model, it's very simple, right? We know that we've got to have reductions in employment from an increase in wages in a competitive model. That reduction is going to be bigger the more elastic labor demand. But in a monopsonistic model, it's actually a little bit more complicated. And the reason is, as we've talked about, right, in a monopsonistic model, when you have an increase in the minimum wage, you're increasing wages that workers are paying. You're actually decreasing the marginal cost of a worker from the perspective of the firm, right? And the reason we've got our upward sloping labor supply curve, right, and our downward sloping MRP. Our marginal expense of labor is always going to be higher than our labor supply curve, right, higher than the wage. When we have a small increase in the minimum wage, we go from having the marginal cost of a worker be given by the marginal expense of labor to having the marginal cost of worker be the minimum wage, right? And the reason is it's no longer the case that we need to give everybody a raise in order to hire more. And so as a result of that, if we think about the scale and substitution effects that come about from a minimum wage increase, firms are going to react in the long run as if the cost of an extra worker was decreased. right? So we should expect that when the minimum wage goes into effect, if it's a small minimum wage increase, that's actually going to decrease the amount of capital that we use per worker, right? We're going to substitute away from capital and towards labor as a result of this minimum wage. And likewise, there's going to be a scale effect, right? We're going to increase the amount of production because each worker is now cheaper to us in total than they were before. So kind of paradoxically or somewhat confusingly, right, if we've got a monopsonistic model and we have a small minimum wage increase, the kind of minimum wage increase that would increase employment in the short run, we should expect it to increase employment even more in the long run for exactly the same reasons that it increased employment in the short run. So essentially what we can learn here is that if we compare the long run and the short run, right, the long run is going to be the short run, but more so, right? Everything is going to change more in the long run than it does in the short run, in the same direction as it changed in the short run. Okay. So another question, right? When we are learning about how the minimum wage affects employment at a local level, how does that local change compare to a national change? And there's kind of two things that we might want to think about, right? The first is, if we think about the elasticity of demand for labor, it's likely going to be higher at the local level than it is at the national level, right? And the reason, as we've talked about, is if I've got a call center and I'm hiring workers in Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas City, Kansas raises its minimum wage, or I'm sorry, Missouri raises its minimum wage, maybe I move my call center to Kansas City, Kansas, right? Or my competitor in Kansas City, Kansas is able to continue to offer low prices, and I'm going to lose business to my competitor. If we have a national minimum wage increase, we're not going to see businesses shifting from one part of the country to the other. They would either have to reduce overall size or shift from the United States to other countries. Because that's going to be harder to do than to shift from one part of the United States to another, we're generally going to expect that the elasticity of demand for labor is going to be lower at the national level, and therefore the negative effects of a minimum wage on employment are going to be smaller at the national level than at the local level. So if we look at these kind of big negative effects from the Seattle minimum wage increase, maybe we would say, oh, don't worry so much, hold your horses on freaking out. If that had happened across the entire state of Washington, or even more so across the entire United States, you would have seen a smaller reduction in employment. On the other hand, if we think about things like invention of labor-saving technologies, maybe that's more likely to happen from a national minimum wage increase than from a local minimum. McDonald's might not find it worth it to go about figuring out how to put in self-service kiosks all over their stores, or figuring out how to prepare more of their food on an off-site factory or assembly line where they can use more capital, if the minimum wage just went up in New Jersey or just went up in Seattle. They might say, sorry, those franchises are going to have to eat those higher labor costs. But if the minimum wage went up nationally, they might be more likely to make those sorts of changes because every single one of their franchisees is facing those higher labor. So there's a reason to think that a national minimum wage increase would have a bigger effect on employment than a local minimum wage increase. There's a reason to think that it might have a smaller effect. Then another thing to think about, right? The last thing we want to think about when we think about how to extrapolate the effect of the minimum wage is, should we expect that minimum wages are going to have a bigger or smaller effect on the places that choose to raise their minimum wages than they do on the kind of places that don't choose to raise their minimum? So we talked about a similar issue here, right, which is that states are generally more likely to raise their minimum wages in good economic times than in bad economic times, and that's going to create bias. But this is a slightly different question, right? We're not asking about bias, we're asking about the magnitude of the real effects. So we might think that places like Seattle and New Jersey that raised their minimum wages would suffer less from a minimum wage increase, or employment reductions or bigger employment gains, than would places like South Carolina or Wyoming that have low minimum wages. The reason for that is, they raised their minimum wage for a reason. Maybe the reason that they raised their minimum wage is because they have the kind of local economies that can support a higher minimum. Right? They've got larger service sectors, their overall wage levels are smaller, right? So they're changing the wages for a smaller portion of their overall economy. In general, wages are higher in these areas. On the other hand, maybe it's actually the opposite. Maybe the minimum wage would do the most good in the places least likely to increase it. And one argument for that is maybe employers are less concentrated in places like New Jersey and Seattle than they are in places like Wyoming and South Carolina. And in fact, if we think about the politics of a minimum wage, maybe it's exactly in the sort of places that have large, powerful local employers that you're least likely to see a minimum wage go up. So I've shown you these graphs before, but I just want you to compare here. If we look at the graphs of where in the country have the highest minimum wages, and then we look at the graphs of where in the country have the most employer concentration, what we're going to see is that these coastal areas, metropolitan areas that have the highest minimum wages tend to have fairly low concentration of employers. Whereas the areas that have low minimum wages, particularly kind of the Southeast and the Mountain West, tend to have fairly high concentration of employers, especially the Mountain West. The Southeast is a little bit of a patchwork. So we might think that actually we've got more monopsony power in the parts of the country that have generally lower minimum. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about, and then I'm going to let you guys go, is how we can learn from the minimum wage about other kinds of policies we could use to try to raise wages above where they're left by market force. So the minimum wage is useful, as we've talked about, but it's also a blunt instrument, right? If we say that we're going to raise wages to $15 an hour for everybody, that probably is too little to help some people whose wages are lower than they should be because of market power of employers. And it's too much to help other people, right? It's going to push other people's wages above their marginal revenue product. So there's other strategies that might give us a little bit more of a fine-grained approach. So one thing is several states, including California, have official wage boards. So what this means is that the governor is allowed to basically convene a board of consisting of kind of agriculture sector employers and agriculture sector labor unions or workers, and local and government officials, and sit down together and decide on a minimum wage that affects a particular sector of the economy. Right? We could say agricultural workers have to be paid at least $11 an hour, or delivery drivers have to be paid at least $17 an hour, something like this. Potentially, this could have a similar effect as a minimum wage. In many ways, it is a minimum wage, but because sector specific, it could be set at a level that is small from the perspective of the sector. Right? So if you were careful enough about the way you use this power, potentially set minimum wages at the sector level that are in between the profit maximizing wages that employers set and the actual marginal revenue products of workers, right? Set minimum wages at levels that are going to increase employment. We could also think about policies that increase labor market competition, right? So things like increasing antitrust as a tool that we use when employers are concentrated in labor markets rather than just being concentrated in product markets, or using policies that reduce the degree to which employers have market power. So things like requiring employers to publish information about the wages that they pay. In Scandinavia, for example, you can look up anybody's pay, which is kind of nuts from an American perspective, right? But that's something that's going to give workers a lot more bargaining power when they go to employers and try to set them. And the last possibility that you might want to think about is, in many countries, and I believe California actually tried to do this, there is a national minimum wage or a broad minimum wage that unions are allowed to write exemptions. So we could set a minimum wage of $15 an hour, but say any contract negotiated between a union and an employer could choose a wage below that level. That kind of gives two advantages. One is that in theory, if there are certain sectors of the economy that are not productive enough to justify a high minimum wage, unions and employers could negotiate to a lower wage. It also preserves the ability for unions to negotiate on benefits rather than just on wages. So as we talked about, if we're in a situation where a high minimum wage means that employers are going to set a large number of Santa beard pollings, this could be a strategy to allow workers and employers to get back to a Pareto optimal allocation. Of course, the other effect of this, and the main reason that this is something that's seriously discussed, is that it would probably greatly increase the rate of unionization, which is something that you might think is great if you're a union, or if you think that unions are a positive force in the economy, might not be as excited about if you're not as excited about it. Okay, so I think I've given you guys enough content for today, enough to think about. Thank you for bearing with me this far, and I look forward to reading your Moodle posts and hearing your discussions of all of this soon.